Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer dedicated to supporting System Center technologies. Today is session 10 in an ongoing series we have discussing application management in Configuration Manager 2012. We, so far, in parts 1 through 9, have gone through an introduction to application management, seen how we create applications and packages on the server side, then seen on the client side how those actually are received and work. And then we went back to the server side and looked again at packages and applications, again building those, but specifically with a look under the covers as to what was going on in the database and in the log files, and how different information made its way through on the server side at a deeper level when we did those creations. Then we looked specifically at the distribution point and some behind the scenes discussion there. Now we've moved back to the client side. Session 9 was looking at the client, specifically at package deployment and the different pieces of the client that came into focus to get packages actually installed. So today's session takes us all the way through. Now we're on applications. So we have an application that we're going to watch on the client side and see what is required on the under the covers look to get that application actually installed. So one thing to kind of level set, I struggled a bit whenever I thought about how to present this discussion about behind the scenes look at applications. And frankly, it's not because it's necessarily hard to do, but there are a lot of moving parts. So just to walk through and show one application getting installed is going to take some time, just to go through all the pieces. So I thought about maybe doing several different variations, because with applications we can certainly have the basic application. We can also add derivations in there with dependencies and requirement rules and supersedence scenarios and that kind of thing. Essentially, the basic structure of how you install an application is similar across all of those. Yes, there are nuances for each, but in interest of trying to at least give some framework as to how this stuff works, and then allow that to be kind of a seeding ground for further knowledge for you to explore and have the ability to look into it with some knowledge of where some of those differences may come in. I decided to just do a basic application. I'll show you along the way where certain other evaluations might come into play and so on. But in the interest of time and interest of trying to get through this and be able to show you some decent depth on the structure that we have right now, I decided just to do one application. So that's what I'll do in the demo. So like in the package discussion, what I've tried to do here is illustrate the various components that are in play. Okay. Now I've again put a line here. This is essentially the dividing line between the client communication and the management point communication. So the way these different colored lines are trying to line up is just showing the flow through the various components that are involved. So first of all, notice the different components are listed out here, and some of them are grouped together, like in this case and this case. One thing you're going to notice when we get into the demo is that all of these components actually chatter back and forth with each other quite a bit. So while it looks to be a streamlined one component, then the next component, then the next component, it's really not that, right? All of these components interrelate. And so the way it's cleanly depicted here isn't really the story when we get to the client, and I'll show you that. But in general, how this works. So remember that on the client, for the client to learn about anything, we have to have the client read policy. Client policy actually tells the client what to do. That is generically true, regardless of whether we're talking about packages, applications, instructions for a client agent, hardware inventory settings. It doesn't matter. Every instruction the client gets is from the management point, ultimately the site server, in terms of policy. The way the client learns about that, we talked about last time, is that we have a component on the client called policy agent that will call into the management point and make the request. So another statement here. Certainly, there are a lot of components depicted in this little diagram that I have on the screen. This is not an exhaustive list of the various components that are there. These are key components. So when I say the policy agent is the first one in line, followed by policy evaluator, like you see, That doesn't mean those are the only components involved in getting the policy requests to the management point. Okay, so just be clear with that. There are some other things that may come into play on the back end, but these are the major components you look at to see what happened. So policy agent will actually go up on a polling cycle by default every hour and make a request of the management point. The component specifically on the management point is MP_policy. So talked about in the package session last time that certain ones of these logs will really not contain much information. In fact, some of them may not even show up at all unless you have verbose and debug logging turned on. Definitely suggest that you do that. I'll show you that again when we get to the client side, how you turn that on. Okay. So we will make a request to the management point. The management point doesn't know anything about policy on its own. So when the management point receives the request, it's going to know who the client is, the information about it, and so on. And what it's going to do is forward that request to the site's database that owns the client. If we have policy that is updated and ready for the client to consume, then we will get it back at the management point and forward it down ultimately to policy agent. So policy agent will stage that into a WMI namespace known as requested config. So I showed you that last time. I'll show it to you again in this session. Requested config has a couple of different partitions, one for the machine, one for the user. So if you're looking for machine policy, it's requesting config. If you're looking for the user if you're looking for the machine policy, it's the machine partition, the namespace of requested config. If you're looking for the other, then it's the user policy, if you're looking for the user partition. I think I said that right, but if not, you'll understand what I'm saying. Once we get the policy downloaded to the client, Policy Evaluator will take a look at it and evaluate it, and if we're good to go, then Policy Evaluator will place it into the actual config namespace that is active either for the user or the machine. Once that happens, once the policy is in the actual config namespace, the various client components that might need to act on that policy will learn about it and be able to take action. So in our case last time, the component of the client that learned about the fact there was a new package to execute was Execution Manager. That is a component specific for packages. On the application side, if you're expecting to see Execution Manager pick up the application and run with it, that's not at all the component that handles the application. The first one in line for starting the processing of an application is CCM SDK Provider. Then, and you see all these components just kind of go back and forth. Then you see a number of CI components. Here's one SC client. So CI Store, CI Downloader, CI State Store, CI Task Manager, all of these components will talk back and forth, and their job is to basically make sure that the needed components are downloaded, are available in order to execute the application. So here's a good time to basically go on a tangent and remind you. So CI, as we've talked about before, stands for configuration item. Applications, deployment of applications is an action driven by configuration items. In fact, applications, when you define them, as we saw in the deep dive session on applications on the server side, all those are really is configuration items, okay? Which I've said before that application deployment in Config Manager 2012 really does have some similarities to software updates, and it does. It uses the same engine, right? Software updates utilizes configuration items. DCM, as it was in Config Manager 2007 compliance settings in 2012, utilizes configuration items. In fact, that is the engine that is the framework, if you will, at the base for configuration item management. OSD has some play into configuration items. So the point of this is, if you understand configuration items, then you basically understand application deployment on the client side, on the server side even, creating these things. If you don't understand configuration items, if this is new to you, then once you do understand how this works and the flow of things, then for all intents and purposes, you understand how this works for a number of different components, like software updates, like compliance settings, and so on. Yeah, there's certain nuances that are different between the two, but the framework is the same. So CI Store, CI Downloader, CI Task Manager, all of these components will have commonality across the different features. Some of these other ones that you see, Content Access Service, Location Service, Content Transfer Manager, Data Transfer Service that you see down the chain, will have commonality. Okay? So once we get everything in place that we need with these different components, and by the way, this is the component that's responsible for updating Software Center. You'll see that happen as we go along through the logs when we get to the demo in a minute. So then once we have all the pieces in place, we go through a component called App Discovery. This is where we start trying to look at the environment, find out the lay of the land, where things are, and really get a handle on what we need to do. Okay, Dcm Reports, Dcm Reporting, State Messages, this is how we communicate status, if you will, of our deployment, how things are going back to the site. Content Access Service and the related components are responsible for locating the content that we're going to deploy. Okay, and a little note about this. In the demo, you will definitely see all of these components active. If the content is already downloaded to the client and in the cache whenever it comes time to run the application, then you'll certainly see Content Access Service, but you won't see some of these others because there's no need to acquire that content. Okay, and when I say acquire the content, understand that there's two pieces that we have to acquire. First, we have to acquire the configuration item itself, which is done, again, with the CI pieces. Then we have to acquire the actual files that we're going to install on the agent, on the client, and that's done with Content Access Service and so on. Okay? After all that gets done, then it's time to actually deploy the application. We do that with App Enforce. Okay, so you'll see all these work through. Again, session goals, not to go end to end for all of the different possibilities, flavors, things like that that might take place on the client. There's just too many variations and so on to cover in a session like this. But it is a goal of the session to lay the foundation, lay the framework, if you will, so that you're comfortable looking at any scenario with application deployment and piecing things together. Okay, another thing about this, when we get to the demonstration, when we get to the logs, okay, I'm going to show you how to line the logs up in a way that will make sense, that will hopefully be a powerful tool to follow the flow of events. Okay, the logging flow that I'm going to show you is just one example. Like I've already mentioned, there's certain pieces of the equation that may come into play, may not come into play, depending upon a given scenario. So it's not always a hard and fast rule that you're going to see every single component. A good example, like I mentioned, is Content Access Service, trying to find content, cache, whether it's in play, that kind of thing. Another thing I just mentioned, logging tips, definitely need to have verbose and debug logging turned on. In fact, let's just move into the demo environment, and we'll start there, and I'll show you, again, how to enable verbose and debug logging. So if I go on to my client and take a look in the registry, then I can verify that, at least in this case, I have verbose and debug logging turned on. So to turn on verbose logging, I need to make sure log level is set to 0. Now there's some other interesting options here for logging that take effect on the client globally, like whether or not logging's enabled at all, and it is by default, where the logs are stored, how many historical logs you might want to keep, okay, and what the maximum size of a log is. So a little bit about that. So certainly whenever you have additional logging in place, whether it be additional verbosity or additional historical logs kept or additional size, whatever the case may be, if there is a problem that requires troubleshooting, it just makes it easier to go back and be able to see what happened at that moment versus having to recreate. Okay? For that reason, I really do like to have verbose and debug logging turned on universally on clients. That's an individual decision. Yes, there is extra overhead that happens as a result of it. That overhead really isn't even noticeable generally, especially on the kind of systems that we have today. But it's up to you. obviously how you do that. The extra log space, if you want to increase the number of historical logs or the log size, is just additional disk space. Again, typically that's not a problem on the kind of systems and disks that we have today, but ultimately it's your decision. This is where you will go and set these things. If you want to turn on debug logging, there's another registry key to add, and it's down here, a registry key called Debug Logging, strangely enough. Did I pass it? Let's see. Oh, don't think so. Let's see. There we go. It's all the way at the bottom. Debug Logging. And you'll have to add this key and add a value enabled set to true. Now, adding these values into the registry is fine in a one-off scenario. But if you do want to do this kind of manipulation and turn on verbose debug logging and so on a more broad scale, there are command line options that you can use to influence that on the client when it installs. So definitely take a look at that if you want to do it. Certainly much more scalable to do it that way than try to do it one-off on all your clients. Okay, so that's where we turn that on. So we do have it on for my lab. Now, what I'm going to do is do a basic application deployment. You already see it in Software Center, but just to show you, here's my CAS. I have a basic deployment right here. It's the only real deployment that I have active for my systems right now. So I just have the one deployment. Very easy, installs an MSI file, rich copy, and pretty simple. So let's go actually take a look at this and see what we can see on the client. So the first thing about working with logs and trying to trace things through on the client is you always need to pay attention to your timestamp. Okay, so let me go into the logging directory. Okay, first of all, this directory has some logs in it. Let me go ahead and clear those out because I will use this again. So I've created a folder that I'm going to move the logs into when I'm done. Okay, you don't have to do that, but in my case, there's going to be a number of logs. I definitely don't want them to continue to update while I'm working on them, so I'll move them into this folder. Now, let's go to the logging folder on the client and get ready to start this. Okay, CCM logs. There we go. Okay, so again, remember the timestamp is your friend while you're working on logs. Whenever you're tracing anything on the client, pay attention to timestamps. Also, by the way, you notice this says failed. It's really not failed. One of the things that I did to kind of clear the deck is reset the cache on the client and then test run the advertisement to get it ready to run it now. Anytime you jerk the cache contents out and clean it, the next time you try to run something, it will fail. But now, the next time I run it now, it'll run okay. It'll recognize that there's nothing in the cache, and it'll run. So as I get ready to run this, I have the luxury of being in my lab and can go ahead and fire this off at an even time. I just like to do it maybe at a half past a minute here, so I'll keep watching this. And when we roll around to 4630 or get close, I'll go ahead and pull the trigger on this. Okay. So let's go ahead. Retry that, and we're going to capture it. So while this is running, you're going to see it start to download here in a minute and go ahead and install and whatever. The logs are rolling. So at 4630 is when I started, and that's where I'm going to center in on the timestamp to watch the logs and see what happens here as I analyze the logs. And that's something to bear in mind as you're reproducing things in your environment, is that the timestamp is something you definitely need to pay attention to and be able to track back where you can. You don't always have to know the timestamp. It's a luxury if you can do it, like I'm doing it here for demo purposes, but if you can, it's something to do. Okay, so we've downloaded and now we're installing and good to go. So 26 or 4630 is still what I want. So you see all my logs are updating, and here in a minute we'll be done, and I will go ahead and sort all these by timestamp. Let's go ahead and do that so that we have them updating. Okay. And when I'm done here, I'm going to copy these logs out to my folder. Give it just a second or two and it should be finished. A little bit more than a second or two. It shouldn't take much longer though. There we go, installed. So now I'm going to go get every log that was, I'm going to sort it again just to make sure I don't miss anything. And I'm going to go get every log that was generated within the timestamp that I want. So let me go down here. I'm still at 46. So here I break off 45 and I'm going to move up and grab these logs. Okay, so I'm going to copy them out and paste them in. Now, generally this works. So we've definitely got a number of the logs that we want to see to go through. There's actually one that I know is missing, so I'm going to go make sure that I get it. Let's sort it back here. So I missed that one. I don't know why it didn't show up, but let me go get it. See if there's any more missing. Looks like I have most of them. There's another couple. Let me just do that again. Make sure that I have every log. Yeah. All right. So there's some that hadn't quite finished updating here. So let me go back again, and I'll get all these again. I'll have a few more. So I'll just put them back, and I'll have to overwrite some. That's fine. Don't copy. Good enough. So you see the list of things grew a little bit. So I had a few logs that I had missed. So either way, that works as a general rule. Now, there are some occasions that you'll get into where you will want to look at the timestamp, grab the logs, and some logs that you might actually need to look at will not have updated timestamp. I've seen that in Configuration Manager 2007. I haven't seen it in 2012 yet, but at least be aware of it. This is a good approach to try to get a handle on the logs that update. Here, we did get them all, but you might miss some in case, for some reason, the timestamp doesn't update. The log may still be active. It may actually be writing things there, but there may be something that's preventing the timestamp from updating in a view like this. The other thing that you run the risk of with this, as you're running the application deployment, there are other threads on the client that are processing as well. So it could be just coincidence one of those other threads processes happens to update the timestamp while you're watching things happen and gets thrown into the mix and really shouldn't be. It really has no bearing, right? So you'll have to weed some of those out too. Generally it's obvious. So the luxury of what I've done now by moving it across, I know that these logs that are on the client will continue to update, but the logs that I've copied out here are done. We're not going to continue to update those at all. I can look at those at my leisure and good to go. So now what I want to do is I wanted to show you, I thought about going through these individually and just showing you how things work. You can see how many of them there are, and you can see how tedious that probably would have been. So I thought that I will show you the way that you can approach this to figure out how these different components work. So if you want to take an action, you don't have a clue how anything works and what components are involved and that kind of thing, but you want to learn it on the client, the logs are your friend. So you can take that action, watch the timestamp like I did, pull over the logs when you realize that action has completed, and then start to look at these logs collectively to find out what happened. So what I'm going to show you is a really cool technique to be able to do that. So I'm going to launch cmtrace. And it's empty now, so I'm just going to open up, hit File, Open. And it's going to open me back up to my log folder here. That's where I last had it. Typically, it's going to open you up to the Config Manager folder. Okay, in my case, I'd already focused here, so no big deal. So I'm going to select every single log in this folder. And then I'm going to set this flag, Merge Files. So it's going to go through and open every single log in chronological order so I can watch the timestamp and see all of the logs interplaying against one another. Okay, so it's really, really cool. So let's go down, and 4630 was what I care about. So let's go to 74630. As far as the timestamp, we're there. So let's move up a little bit. So right at the top where I see 4630, that's where I should see processing begin, right around there, for the deployment that I just triggered. So maybe 29, whatever it is, right here. Okay. So the very first component in line, and by the way, notice where I am on the scroll bar. So notice how much logging is generated. So don't worry, we're not going to go through line by line every single thing. I want to show you the highlights here. One thing about Config Manager, the logging is fantastic. If you want to know what's going on the client, the logs will tell you what's happening, right? You can piece a lot of things together. With fantastic logging comes a lot of sometimes noise as we track things that take place. Not noise in terms of what the client's doing, noise in terms of sometimes there's redundancy, which is good to have that in case there's a problem in one of those redundant steps. We can see it, but it just creates a lot of lines of log that you may not need to look at in a scenario like this. Either way, we start at the top. We have the CCM SDK provider. So we realize now that we have a user, in this case me, that's kicked off an action to start deploying the application. So CCM SDK provider is called. We're going to execute a method to get things rolling. And here we see CI state store. Okay? And we recognize that we're trying to initiate deployment of a particular CI. So this is a unique string of numbers, a GUID if you will, that uniquely identifies the CI that we're trying to take action on. There's a number of different configuration items. There's application configuration items. There's software update configuration items. There's compliance settings configuration. It's a whole library of configuration items. Again, I showed some of those to you, some of the tables involved in the database during the server-side discussion of applications. Okay? So the point of this is, in our logs, we will certainly represent in certain places for you the name of the given application that we're trying to work on. But more often than not, we're going to instead show you this GUID. So you need to have a way to be able to correlate this GUID back to the application that you're actually looking at. So how do you do that? Well, it's easy enough. So if you take this information and go back to the console, you can find and match up your application real easily. So just look at this part, application underscore E93 BB. That's enough. So let's go back to our console here and look at this entry. So right here you see, by default, this is the way you're going to have your view, okay, without that column. But if you come up here and add the CI underscore unique ID column, then you're going to have this long string of numbers. And you see right away, there it is, E93BB. So we know right away that we are looking at the same application that we're trying to deploy. It's just now we're looking at it through the GUID representation versus the friendly name. So as long as we keep that GUID in our mind, we can track through and stay on track through the log. There is another place that we'll change and have another GUID here in a minute. I'll show you that as we get to it. Okay, so back to the log. All right, so let's track through it. So here we have revision 2, and we notice that it's targeted for system. Again, I'll stop as I go through this in a couple of places and show you some interesting things, but I won't belabor the point. I will definitely scroll through a lot of this. Okay, so we are wanting to acquire the configuration items, so we need to get the context for or get the content for the configuration item, get it downloaded, and so on. Here again, we see confirmation is targeted to system. A question came up, by the way, at one point about some of these references in the log, the // whatever it is, .cpp. This is not anything on the system. This is really not anything to pay attention to as far as tracing the events on your client. This is more just reference that's part of logging, and you can ignore it as far as tracing generally. All right. So notice that I'm in CI store. So I hand it off, CCM SDK provider, now CI state store, now CI store, now CI agent. Okay. So now we're going to create a job. We've got to go create a job to validate, acquire the content, whatever. And so here we're going to go look for this content. We're going to start looking for it, evaluating it, that kind of thing. So we see a bunch of entries in the CI store. We see us moving waiting for assigned CI transitions and back and forth, back and forth. You're going to see a lot of movement, communication between these different components as I scroll. So now we've done a little bit of preparation work. We're going to initiate the CI download. We don't do that directly in CI agent. We call into another component, CI downloader, to actually get the configuration item itself downloaded. Now, understand, downloading the CI is different than downloading the actual files needed for the application. And you'll see that as we move along. So we'll get the CI evaluated, see if we need to do any downloading. If we do CI downloader, we'll do it. So here we are checking to see if we need anything. We're evaluating the CI again. We're still tracking along. We see that it's now changed. It's not just application underscore, now it's required application, but it's still the same GUID. Okay. Again, targeted to system, tracking on along, download payload information. Again, for this, version 2, calculating our scope for this as well, and on we go, calculating hash for the content cryptographic provider, and so on, back and forth to CI store. Here's your CI downloader. Again, you can track through all this very easily, follow what's going on here. Again, downloading payload, and I'm just going to start scrolling through. By the way, let me pause here. So you see, right in the middle of this chain, we see meter manager. Okay. Well, if you look at this, it really doesn't look like it has anything to do at all with what's going on with the application download. So it's possible this is just a component, likely, in fact, that comes into the process, doesn't really have any bearing on what we're doing. It's just happened to fire at the same time we were doing our app deployment, so we see it in the logs. Okay, so that's just an example of what I was talking about. The other thing to comment on in the log, so you see a tremendous amount of activity happening within a single second time frame. You see 3 logs happening in different orders in that time frame. When you merge the logs together and when things line up by time, there's at least the potential. Haven't seen it so far in Config Manager 2012, haven't really looked that hard either, but in Config Manager 2007 with the log viewer, and I'm assuming it holds true as 2012 as well, if you have multiple threads firing all within the same second, you won't always get those threads in order of activity. So certainly you can track through and confirm that a various thread was active and interacting with other threads on the client at a given second. But sometimes, the first thread that was active, thread A, might actually appear third in the list for a given second. So just factor that in. Not a big deal. It definitely tells you what was going on when, but might not always be in the order that you expect. Okay, let's go back up here for a second. So notice state store. So this is interesting. Okay, so notice that we're looking. CI downloaders calling in. We're going to calculate our scope. We have to get some information about the scope. Here we're going to go into the CI store, and here we do what looks kind of suspicious. We execute what looks very much to be like a SQL query. Okay. And notice that it is on our same CI. So here is our configuration item right here that we're looking at. Well, that's interesting, right? Because we don't have SQL on the client. So where are we actually doing the SQL transaction to? It's not a WMI query. Okay. We didn't connect to any namespaces. So what's actually going on? The interesting thing is, in Config Manager 2012, we absolutely have a database on every single one of our clients. Okay, I'll show that to you as we go along. I'll show you this query run as we go along. But this is just to show you something that you can find in the logs. Logs are full of really rich information. You can learn a lot about the client just by reading the logs to see what goes on in various cases. Because here is where I learned that we actually have a database on the client and what's in it. So we'll go look at the database after we get done with looking at the logs. Okay, so we go along. Go on down again. We're CI store, CI downloader, just talking back and forth. Eventually we'll get to past all this. We have some eval tasks going on. I'm just going to scroll on down past it. CI downloader is still active. If you want to read through these line by line, it's very useful information to do. It takes a while, so I'll just pass it for now. So ultimately, we have the CI components talking back and forth. We get to a point called app discovery. Okay, so app discovery kicks in. We've downloaded enough about the CI, verified it, that we need to go check the application that we're trying to deploy and learn information about it, figure out our environment and how we need to operate. So app discovery comes in, and the first thing it's going to do is connect to WMI. So here's an interesting WMI namespace. Okay, we'll go look at that in just a second. And it's going to execute a query to learn information about the CI. Well, here's the query it's going to execute against WMI. Okay? So we spent some time looking in WMI. Let's go look at it now. And I want to show you this namespace. In fact, with the WMI discussion, let me kind of pause in the flow of things and go back to the beginning. So whenever we started, I was already in Software Center, right? I already had this application here. So if you remember the PowerPoint, I mentioned that the very first thing that has to happen on the client whenever we deploy an application is the client has to learn about it, has to get policy, has to learn that there's information out there. The way it does that is Policy Agent. Then it hands it off to Policy Evaluator. There's namespaces in WMI where we are putting this information. I want to show you, we kind of skipped those because the policy evaluations already happened. That's how I see it in Software Center. But let's go back and I'll show you those key namespaces in WMI, and then we will get into, for policy, and then we'll get into this namespace that we're using in App Discovery. So if I go into WebM Test on my client, okay, then I can connect up to my namespace that I care about. Just going to connect. And the first one, okay, so I targeted this deployment to my machine. If I would have targeted it to the user, then I would need to go into the user namespace. There is a user namespace just like there is a machine namespace. Machine is a little bit cleaner, so I'll go into this one. And then the first place policy stops is requested config. Requested config is very similar to actual config, but there are some differences. I'll just show you the namespaces here and scroll down, just let you get a look at some of these, and then I'll move to actual config because they are the same, at least for the ones I'm going to show you. So here is where we will stop over an actual config. We have application CI assignment, okay, application management client config. So we are specifically dealing with applications, so that's where we will have the information stored. So let's go connect up to actual config, and we will have that same namespace. Okay. So now, if I go look in that namespace, well, first of all, I'm connected to the namespace, so I can very easily just drop that query into here and run it just like the agent did and get a result back. Well, if I actually copied it correctly. So let me go copy it again, make sure I get it. Hopefully I got it right that time. Query invalid class. What did I do wrong? Oh, sorry. I'm in the wrong namespace. I forgot to connect up. Let me go change my namespace to the right one. So let's go connect to where the client did, which is root CCM CI model. It's behind, but it is CCM CI model. Or models, I believe. There we go. Now if I take that query, what's still in there, and apply, then I'll get results back. So basically, I'm doing a select star from this namespace where the CI is this thing that we've been talking about. So here it is. If I double click on it and click show off, then I'll learn some information about it. Nothing hugely interesting here, but it is interesting to the system. Okay. So if I go into this namespace directly, instead of doing the query, I can see more information in there, perhaps if we have multiple applications. So CCM, go down a little bit, application, delivery type, instances. Here's my operation. So here's that one. I just have one application. Again, I can get to it this way too. No big deal, right? So this actually, the app delivery type specifies another configuration item. Again, meaningful to the system, but we won't dig into it here. There is another item here that we can look at. Let's see. Let's see what we did. Yeah. All right. Let's look in here. So app delivery type. Let's see if we have anything in here. Yeah. Okay. So app delivery type. Dig into this because it's still application. Now we see a little bit more information and details about this particular app and so on. So for example, we see by looking at this that we have the rich copy app. That's what I've deployed. We have detection method of MSI. It's an install that we want to do. Here's the content ID, which I'll show you in just a minute. Okay. In fact, let's just go over to it now because you're going to see this come up in just a minute. So whenever we deploy the application is not where the content actually lives. The application defines what we're going to deploy for sure, but the actual deployment type is where we define what we're going to deploy. So the content _54C is something that describes the deployment type, or the content that's on the deployment type. So if we go back to our application in the console, look at deployment types, then notice we have the content ID column. So as soon as it refreshes here, then we'll be able to look, and here indeed is the content ID. So again, you can match these things back and forth to the console, just if you understand what these things mean and so on. All right, so back to our client. All right, and more stuff. It's revision 1. There are actions for uninstall, but no content, really. Nothing defined that I've deployed anyway. There is the uninstall command line defined and so on, but there you go. Okay, so now, do you have to live in WMI? No. You probably don't spend or won't spend a tremendous amount of time in WMI, but this again is all for education purposes, to help you understand where different pieces of information are stored on the client. So when it does come to troubleshooting, you can have that understanding of where to go look. So this is useful if I want to verify, for example, that the client actually knows about the application to deploy. So one potential scenario that I've run into as I've been learning Config Manager 2012 that cost me some time, actually, is when you have deployment rules or requirements, if you will, on an application. If the client doesn't or evaluates those rules and cannot install the application, it won't even show up. It'll certainly tell you that if you look at the monitoring space in the console. It will come back and say requirements not met. But if you don't think to look there first, you might be looking at the client thinking, what in the world's wrong? Why doesn't my deployment show up? The truth is, it did show up. The requirements weren't met. You can sift that through in the logs. You can also look in WMI and confirm that the application actually is known, but for whatever reason the requirements weren't met, so we don't display it to you. Okay, so there are useful reasons to go into WMI and verify information and so on. So okay, let's go ahead and leave WMI for here. Again, not an exhaustive tour of WMI. There's a lot of information here. You can just scroll down, by the way, and see in the CI model namespace. So we've talked about in previous sessions how on an application you can define rules and so on that will look in Active Directory, will look on the file system, will look in the registry and all sorts of things, metabase. So you'll see all these classes rolling through, and so there's a lot of definition here to accommodate all the different settings that you can do on the client SQL query, different values, WQL query, and so on. So there's a lot of information here. Okay. So now back to the logs. So now we're in app discovery. So we have connected to WMI. We've run information. We've run this query to learn about the actual application we're trying to deploy. Here it is, again, listed in full English, and again, associating with the GUID, okay, of the deployment type this time. First thing we do is we're going to discover whether this application is installed. We're going to use the MSI discovery that was configured on the application. So MSI is one, that's easy. If you're deploying an MSI, very easy to set that up. System will do it for you if you run through the wizard. If you're deploying something that requires you to look at the file system, the registry, again, not hard to set up, pretty straightforward to configure it. You can also use scripts. So depending on the type of detection method configured for the app, you'll see that show up here. In this case, we're going to detect it, look for a product with this GUID, and find out if it's installed. So notice we haven't installed anything yet, right? We're going to check first before we go through the work of installing to see if it's there. If it's there, why do it again? Why install it a second time? That it just generates extra work on the client, could be disruptive for the user, that kind of thing. So much like software updates, we're just going to verify, is it there or is it not? If it's there, we just bypass it and return success. If it's not there, then we'll go and install it. So we check it, find out, nope, it's not there, did not find any instances of this. So we move on. MSI not discovered. MSI application not discovered. Cool. So we're done with that discovery, and we move back into CIs. So at this point, we have enough information that it's time to report back what we found. So we see DCM reporting come in. Or reports and reporting come in and process through, and we're sending up information back to the site to let the administrators know what's going on. We see some other components working their way in. Here's CI downloader, more DCM reporting. Okay, so a lot of activity. We're going to keep scrolling. Okay, app intent eval is back, so we're adding our application scope. Now, notice that the intention, adding the scope, inserting any rules, okay, adding our discovery rules, okay, that's back to DCM reporting. So app intent is just kicking in here. So back to DCM reporting. So back to app intent. Okay, no dependencies for deployment type. So here is where we're going through the application and trying to figure out, are there things on the application that we need to evaluate? In this case, are there any dependencies? If there were, then we would spin off a thread to go evaluate those things and see what we need to do. Again, not showing that here because of the added complexity and the time it's taking me anyway to run through these logs. But you get an idea where you would see us shoot off and start to process that if we did have any dependencies. Then we scroll on down. Again, here's DCM reporting. We'll get back to app intent here in just a minute. Okay, so add app policy. Let's keep going. App intent eval. So scope ID. Let's see, where are we going? Keep on moving. Scrolling on through, I don't know if I missed it yet or not. Let's see. You will see app intent eval also involved in processing through and figuring out any supersedence relationships. Okay, actually, I think I might have here. Let me just search up real quick. Probably the easiest way to do that. That should be enough. Let me see if I can find it. Oops, maybe I spelled it wrong. Let me try it again. Let me just do super. See if I can go up and try it again. Let me just keep searching up. I should hit it. App intent eval. Yeah, so deployment type does not supersede any other deployment type. So you see, app intent eval, I just skimmed right over this. No dependencies, then we are evaluating supersedence. There's also going to be some requirement rules in there that we'll evaluate and so on. Right? So that's where we do that checking, and we'll spin off threads accordingly. So let's scroll on down. Okay, let's move on through all of this. Again, there's a lot of chatter back and forth between the various components. So if I scroll down to the real meat of this, then I'm going to see that we're going to actually finally, after we get through resolving everything, start to go out and try to locate content. So what I'm looking for right now is our first rollover to content access, so CAS, where we're going to actually try to go get the content downloaded. So we're working on CIs right now. And pretty soon, there we go. So content access, right? So CI downloader, now we're going to actually go get the content. Okay, here. Okay, so we start going through it. So the first thing we have to do is figure out the state of our system. Well, the first thing we're going to do is go actually try to find out, do we have access to the content? So we're going to go create a location request, okay, and send that in. Okay, and then, so I showed you last time, and I won't go back through it again. So at this stage, whenever we create our location request, we're handing off to location services. You can see it in the log right here that we hand off to location services. And then location services, if I wanted to show you all the way through the management point, we actually hand off this content location request to the management point, the MP_location thread. The management point queries the database, finds out all of the distribution points that are accessible to us, hands that back to the management point hands it back to the client, location services gets it, and returns the list. Okay, so here we should get back a list of distribution points that are accessible. Here's the reply. We see the distribution point in the list right here. Now, notice this is not a UNC path. This is an HTTP location. So this is not really a distribution point. This is a location on a web server so that we can connect to IIS and use bits, preferentially, to download the content. Okay. All right. So location services returns to us. Then location services is going to hand off to CAS, Content Access Service, and we're going to split that out, list out the information, and so on. You see us churning back and forth. Ultimately, we get and list a distribution point. Okay. Then we have to go through and figure out our cache location. So we know that we have the content accessible to us. Now we have to have a place to put it. So we're going to look and find out what the state of our cache is. So we're going to get cache content, find cache information, figure out our cache configuration, free disk space configuration, delete any space if we need to, figure out that we don't need to. There's plenty of space in the cache. So we're good. Now we're going to store the content in the cache. And in this case, we're going to create a folder called Z. So if we look in the cache, we've already downloaded this. So if we look in CCM cache, we in fact see a folder called Z. Okay, so if we look in Z, we will see the content that we downloaded as part of deploying our application. Okay, so we roll on through, and we're requesting at this stage the content to be downloaded. Again, CAS does not do that for us. It actually calls into other components. So you see CAS submitting a content transfer manager job 722F whatever, and we're going to execute this under the system context. So if we scroll on down, we would expect to see content transfer manager kick in. Again, 722F, so we should see that here in just a sec. If I don't pass it, I'm going a little bit slower just to make sure. Let me search up for it. See if I missed it. Oh, let's see. Scroll on down. Oh, let's see. Okay, I think I must have missed it because I see the next component in line already logging a decent amount. So let's go up. So going through the logs is very educational. It can be tedious at times, so bear with me, but we'll have it here in a minute. Let's see. I'll search for CTM job in a minute if I have to. Oh yeah, let me search for it. CTM, search down. That way I'll find where my GUID was, and then I'll search for the GUID. There we are. So here, we're submitting the CTM job. So now if I search for this GUID, I should be able to find what I'm looking for. There we are. So let's search down for this again. And here we are. Okay, download info, content access. Let's search again. Search again. Huh, interesting. So I'm not finding it. So maybe I'm just missing it. Did I even copy that log? Let's see. Ah, that must be what it is. I don't have Content Transfer Manager here. Okay, so my bad. I omitted. I did not grab Content Transfer Manager. So trust me that Content Transfer Manager would be involved. So you would actually see Content Transfer Manager. Let's get back to where I was. Content Transfer Manager kick in and have this particular job. Only thing Content Transfer Manager does is actually make a call to Data Transfer Service. Data Transfer Service is the one that actually does the transfer of the data. And you saw that down here. Let's get back to it. Scroll on down. There we go. So Data Transfer Service is invoked. So now we need to download the file. Here's where we're downloading it from. Okay, and we're going to call in and grab it. So notice that SC Client is here, and basically this is updating the Software Center as we're rolling. Okay, so DTS job is going to download. We see DTS running. We're downloading the manifest. Data Transfer Service here. Again, impersonating a user. Detecting if clients on the internet. Getting ready to download. Should see some more Data Transfer Service in just a minute. Here we go. Should see a little block of it. There we go. So here we're connecting to the distribution point via IIS, and we're downloading files. So you see a few files here that are starting to come down. And you'll notice here in just a minute that we're actually using bits. Here's a DTS job we're finishing up. Once we finish with the DTS job, we would hand control back to Content Transfer Manager. You may not see that because I don't remember if that's where bits is actually flagged in Content Transfer Manager or not. But either way, we don't have that log, so you don't see the handoff back to Content Transfer Manager, and ultimately back to CAS, Content Access. Okay. But once we get finished downloading, we will let CAS know through Content Transfer Manager that we're done. So here's the bits job. Okay, so you do see that Data Transfer Service. That was Data Transfer Service, right? Yes, good. Okay, so you see the bits job here, adding bits job right here. So you do see that. Good. Okay, so we download the content by bits preferentially, and you see the total amount of data that's been transferred. Ultimately, it will hand back to CAS. You'll see Content Access show back up in the logs here in a minute. See how much crosstalk there is? There's just a bunch of crosstalk between these threads. You just scroll back down over here. Come on, Content Access, where are you? There we go. I think I just saw it. Yeah, Content Access fired up around here. So we have received the content, and in a minute we will see the final thread come into play. So still more DTS. We'll see the final thread that we're going to talk about come into play, and that is a thread called app enforce. So when we see app enforce, that's the component that's actually going to do the install. And all right, let's scroll on down a little bit quicker. There we go. So app enforce. So we've essentially, up until this point, done all of our pre-work. We found the CIs. We've made the CIs available, made sure they were there. We found the content, made sure we downloaded the content into the local cache. Now it's all there. Now we're ready to pull the trigger. So app enforce is invoked. Raise an event, get started, scroll on through, creating an instance, getting ready to go, starting the install. Ultimately, we'll have the command line show up, sending a state message, app enforce, come on down, targeted to machine, let's go on down, where's app enforce, here we go. So we're detecting again, okay, again, didn't find the MSI, app enforce is preparing the command line, we're doing it out of the Z folder, starting the execution, running it. Ultimately, we finish. Okay, and then we go back through and we will detect again. Okay, and let's see, app enforce. We're done. Okay, and after we get done, app enforce will go and redetect to make sure that the app was actually installed. Hopefully, we'll see it in just a second. We're basically to the end of our loop anyway. I want to see if I can find it. Maybe I passed it. I don't know. There's a bunch of activity in the log, but you definitely saw app enforce install it. Yeah, so I'm not going to keep looking for it. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. Maybe this is it. So app enforce, post-install behavior is based on exit code, so we just finished installing. We should see, let's keep on scrolling down now, we should see app enforce fire up again and actually redetect whether we actually have it installed or not, and this time be successful. Okay, so let's see, there we go. Okay, just as I'm about to give up. Cool. So performing detection, this time we found it, we've discovered it, so we're going to go back and return a success. So we are good to go. So we're successful, and the application's installed just like we saw it. So that is a complete walkthrough of the highlights, anyway, of the logs. So you definitely see how much crosstalk there is, how much activity there is, and to try to go through that for multiple situations would be a lot. So we'll leave it at that, give you the framework for how you can do this on your own. Now, last thing I want to talk about. So I've shown you WMI, at least a few things in WMI. Let me close this out. I've shown you the logs. I mentioned that there is a database on the client, and there certainly is. So if we go into the C drive and go into our client folder, then we will see a database. So let's go look at an SDF file. So by searching for SDF, we see ccmstore.sdf. Now this is a live file. Don't mess with it on the client. But certainly it's interesting, at least for educational purposes, to see this. So what I've done is I've copied this over to my CAS, and we can look at it there. Okay, so I'll close this out. And on the CAS, if I just open SQL Studio, let me do that real quick, then I can connect up to that file. So the file is in the root of my C drive. Okay, let me let that launch here for a second. Hopefully shouldn't take very long. Okay, so finishing up. There we go. So now I have a choice when I connect to either connect to my database engine, or in this case I'm going to connect to SQL Server Compact. This is the path to my database file. Doesn't require any password, so I'm just going to connect. Okay, so if I look at the list of tables, okay, first of all, it's SQL Compact, so I don't have as much ability to right-click on tables, expand them, whatever else. But if you'll recall, this table is the one that we queried in the logs. So all of these are supportive tables. If you want to look at these, go for it. Certainly, all of this is kind of with the caveat of look, don't touch. The questions come up before, hey, do we need to ever worry about getting into this database and editing things? I don't know. I mean, it's too early in the product to see. Certainly there's some things in here that might need to be manipulated. Certainly if things do need to be manipulated here, do it under the guidance of Microsoft support. But this is more for educational, to show you where the pieces fit together. So there are some interesting tables here. The one that I've highlighted is the one we're going to look at. The others are supportive information, as you would expect in a relational database. But this is just good, another place we store data that's good validation to be able to look at, to compare things and make sure the client has the right information. Ultimately, if a client is messed up with this kind of information, my inclination would probably be to reinstall it versus try to fix some things and so on. But either way, that's that's a discussion you can have with your support engineer if you have issues. So let's go run a query on this table. So I'll run that. Okay, so this table has some really interesting information. So like we've been talking about, there are unique IDs for our configuration items. So let's go through and look at hours. So I know that hours is right here on row 20. I've been in here before. So now that I'm on row 20, I can look at the revision ID. I can see who the target for this deployment is. So system, I target it to system here. These, if we look at them, are targeted to users. Okay, let me scroll down a little bit more because I'll look at another one of these in a minute. If I scroll to the right, then I can see information about the current applicability, whether it's applicable, whether it's compliant or not. In my case, on 20, I've installed it, so I am compliant. What my desired state for this CI is, I want it to be available, not required. The severity, any current evaluation state, different flags. Here's the name, so we know that this is the one we're looking at. Here's the actual display name of the app. So scrolling on over, I have some information here in my detailed report column, which I'll look at in just a minute, and various other flags in the database and different things that we can look at. Okay, so good information in this table for sure. So this detailed report, if I want to look at this, okay, I can copy it out. This has some really interesting information, again, for validation purposes and trying to get a lay of the land and that kind of thing. So I can open it up in Notepad, just copied out the information here, and paste it in. Okay. Notice, first of all, how much this scroll bar moved. So let me maximize this and see if we can get everything on the screen. There we are. So this is just XML showing you all the different things about the file. Certainly, here's the deployment type, any supersedence information, so on. Again, this is pretty basic, so not a ton here, but it does give detail about your particular deployment. So notice here, by the way, there's again some of the rules. I'm missing it now. Here, let me just search. There. Okay. So rule right here, compliance rules. Again, not anything really defined here. But if we go to one that does have some compliance rules defined, we'll see some interesting things. So this one down here, primary device, I know, or user device affinity. I know this has some rules on it, so I will copy this out and open this one in Notepad and look at it. Okay, so again, a lot of information here. Okay, and bigger now. So if you look at your rules up here, you'll definitely see more information here that you can tag into, and rule count, and so on, compliance rules. Anyway, so if you like looking at XML, here you go. Again, in the spirit of trying to show where the different information is. That's it. So that really completes what I wanted to show you in the session, kind of end to end, as much as we could, how applications deploy on the client side. This wraps up the discussion that we had planned in this series to talk about the overall application deployment options in Configuration Manager 2012. Now, there are certain things that we haven't talked about in this series that certainly fall into the application deployment category. A couple that I'm intending to do sessions on in the future, but not part of this series, will be using task sequences to deploy content in the environment. In some cases, using task sequences will make sense. You can deploy applications as a part of task sequence. You can deploy packages as a part of task sequencing. So we'll plan a session on that, probably along the same lines where I talk about operating system deployment, since that's where the task sequencing engine is. Another topic that certainly plays into the application deployment discussion is AppV. Haven't talked about AppV at all in this series, so I'll definitely plan to cover that in a future session. May make it a part 11 to the series, I don't know yet, but definitely it will be a topic that we'll cover later on. So for now, we'll end this session, and we'll see you later.